Harold Thompson's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as his pickup truck hit 70 on the empty Vermont back road, the speedometer needle dancing like his racing heart. The golden blur of fur materialized from the roadside brush without warning, a dog, massive and determined, launching itself directly into his path with something clenched between its teeth. The screech of brakes split the autumn silence as rubber burned against asphalt, the truck sliding sideways in a cloud of acrid smoke. Harold's coffee mug shattered against the dashboard, hot liquid splashing across faded photographs of his late wife Ruth that he kept tucked in the sun visor. It wasn't just any dog standing in his headlight beams. It was Buddy, his golden retriever partner from 30 years of sheriff's deputy work, supposedly dead and buried since 1994. The animal's milky, blind eyes stared through him as blood dripped from the crumpled paper in its mouth onto the cracked asphalt. "Jesus Christ," Harold whispered, his voice barely audible over the truck's ticking engine. At 72, he thought God was done sending him emergencies. But as he unfolded the blood-stained letter with trembling fingers, one desperate sentence changed everything. "Please help. They took Emma." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Harold Thompson had always believed that loneliness was something you got used to, like the creaking floorboards in his century-old farmhouse, or the way his left knee protested every morning when he climbed out of bed. At 72, he'd learned to pour coffee for two out of habit. One cup for himself, one for the empty chair where Ruth used to sit with her crossword puzzles and gentle complaints about his terrible posture. The second cup had been sitting untouched for 3 years now, but he kept filling it anyway, talking to her photograph about the weather and the price of heating oil. "Well, I'll be damned, Ruthie," he'd mutter most mornings, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses to read the obituaries first, checking to see who'd beaten him to the finish line. Another day of borrowed time. The house felt too big these days, filled with echoes of a life that once hummed with purpose. 40 years as an elementary school teacher had left him with boxes of thank-you cards from students who were now grandparents themselves, and his brief stint as a part-time sheriff's deputy had given him enough stories to fill lonely evenings. But stories didn't keep you warm or argue with you about what to watch on television. His pension barely covered the basics: heating oil, groceries, the heart medication that kept him upright and breathing. Pride kept him from asking his few remaining neighbors for help, the same stubborn pride that had driven Ruth to distraction when she was alive. "Harold Thompson," she used to say, hands on her hips, "you'd rather freeze to death than admit you need a hand with something." The worst part wasn't the silence or the financial strain, it was the feeling of being invisible, like the world had moved on without bothering to check if he was still keeping up. Young cashiers at the grocery store looked through him, neighbors waved politely but never stopped to talk, and the mailbox held nothing but bills and advertisements for burial insurance. Even God seemed to have forgotten his address. Most days he felt like a ghost haunting his own life, going through the motions of living without any real purpose. His son Michael's army portrait watched him from the mantelpiece, forever 22 and proud in his dress uniform, killed by an IED in Afghanistan 5 years ago. Ruth's cancer had followed 2 years later, as if she couldn't bear to stay in a world that had taken their only child first. "Every day's borrowed time anyway," he'd tell Michael's photograph when the grief felt too heavy to carry alone. But borrowing implied you planned to pay it back eventually, and Harold wasn't sure he had anything left to give. He'd answered his last emergency call, taught his last student, and buried everyone who'd ever needed him. Or so he'd thought, until a blind dog with blood on its teeth reminded him that sometimes the most important calls come when you least expect them. Harold's hands shook as he held the blood-stained letter closer to his truck's dome light, squinting through his bifocals at the shaky handwriting. The paper was standard nursing home stationery. He recognized the pale blue letterhead from when Ruth had been in hospice care. but it was the trembling script that made his chest tighten. Please help. They took Emma. Cabin at Whisper Creek. Running out of time. M. The golden retriever stood motionless in his headlight beams, its cloudy eyes staring past him into some middle distance that only the blind could see. But Harold knew those ears, the way they tilted slightly to the left, the distinctive white patch on the chest that looked like a lopsided star. This was Buddy, his K-9 partner from 3 decades ago when he'd worked part-time for the sheriff's department. The same dog he'd mourned, the same loyal companion he thought he'd lost forever when a drug bust went wrong in 1994. "Buddy?" Harold's voice cracked as he stepped out of the truck, his knees protesting the sudden movement. "Boy, is that really you?" The dog's tail gave the faintest wag, and Harold felt something break open in his chest. A dam of grief he'd been holding back for 30 years. He'd been told Buddy died in that warehouse shootout, caught in the crossfire between deputies and methamphetamine dealers. Harold had blamed himself for months, replaying every decision that led to that moment, wondering if he could have done something different. But here was Buddy, grayer around the muzzle, moving with the careful gait of an old dog whose joints ached with every step, but unmistakably alive. The years had been kinder to the dog than they'd been to Harold. At least Buddy had kept his purpose, his instincts, his ability to find people who needed finding. Harold knelt on the cold asphalt, his heart hammering against his ribs as Buddy approached with cautious steps. The dog's nose found Harold's outstretched hand, and 30 years of separation collapsed into nothing. The scent recognition was mutual. Harold could smell the familiar mixture of wet fur and determination that had gotten them through countless searches for missing persons. "Where did you come from, boy?" Harold whispered, running his fingers through the thick coat. "Who's been taking care of you all these years?" Buddy whined softly and nudged Harold's hand toward the letter. The message might be simple, but the implications were staggering. Someone named M had trusted a blind dog to find help, and somehow that dog had found Harold on a back road in the middle of nowhere. The coincidence felt too enormous to be random, like the universe had finally decided to give him something to do besides count his remaining days. Harold looked at his watch. 4:30 p.m. The November sun would set in less than 3 hours, and Whisper Creek was 15 miles of rough logging roads through dense forest. He should call the police, report this to professionals with proper equipment and training. But Harold knew how slowly the wheels of bureaucracy turned, how long it took to mobilize a search team, how many forms needed to be filled out before anyone actually started looking. "Cops take too long," he told Buddy, who seemed to understand the urgency better than any human dispatcher would. "If someone's in trouble out there, they need help now, not after we've had 3 committee meetings about jurisdiction." Harold's service revolver was still in the gun safe at home, along with his old first aid kit and the heavy-duty flashlight he'd used for night searches. But Buddy was here now, standing in the road like a furry messenger of fate, and every minute of delay could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. He helped Buddy into the passenger seat of the truck, noting how the dog's hips required assistance. Arthritis, probably, the curse of working breeds who'd given their best years to serving others. The dog settled with a contented sigh, as if he'd been waiting decades for this particular ride. "Well, I'll be damned," Harold muttered as he turned the truck toward the dirt road that led to Whisper Creek. "Ruth always said you'd come back when I needed you most." The truck's headlights carved a tunnel through the gathering dusk as they left the paved road behind. Ancient pines pressed in from both sides, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even afternoon light struggled to penetrate. Harold hadn't been out here in years. The old logging roads were supposed to be gated off, abandoned when the timber company went bankrupt in the early 2000s. Buddy sat perfectly still beside him, occasionally lifting his nose to test the air flowing through the cracked window. Even blind, the dog was working, using senses Harold had forgotten he possessed. This was what partnership looked like. Not just companionship, but two beings working toward the same goal with complementary skills. The truck lurched through a deep pothole, and Harold winced as something important-sounding rattled under the hood. His old Ford had seen better decades, but it was still running, still willing to carry him wherever duty called. Just like him, he supposed. Worn around the edges, but not quite ready for the scrap heap. As they bounced deeper into the forest, Harold found himself remembering other searches, other emergencies where he'd followed Buddy through impossible terrain to find lost hikers, runaway teenagers, and confused elderly wanderers. The dog had never failed to find who they were looking for, though sometimes what they found wasn't what they'd hoped for. "I just hope we're not too late this time, boy," Harold said, patting Buddy's head as the truck climbed a steep hill toward the abandoned camp area around Whisper Creek. "I just hope whoever wrote that letter is still waiting for us to show up." The truck died with a mechanical wheeze just as Harold spotted the first cabin through the trees. Steam rose from under the hood in ghostly wisps, and when he turned the key, nothing happened except a click that sounded like disappointment. The old Ford had given him everything it had, but 15 miles of rutted logging roads had finally claimed its last breath. "Well, that's just perfect," Harold muttered, grabbing his flashlight from the glove compartment. The sun was sinking fast behind the pine canopy, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. "Looks like we're walking from here, boy." Buddy emerged from the truck with careful dignity, his arthritic joints protesting the jump down to the forest floor. But the moment his paws touched the ground, the dog's demeanor changed completely. His blind eyes might not work, but his nose was mapping a story Harold couldn't read. Sense of fear, desperation, and something else that made the hackles rise along Buddy's neck. The cabin squatted among the trees like something from a forgotten fairy tale, its weathered logs dark with age and neglect. Harold had been here before, years ago when it was still a functioning hunting lodge. Now broken shutters hung at drunken angles, and the porch sagged under the weight of accumulated winters. But there were fresh tire tracks in the mud. Buddy whined low in his throat and pressed against Harold's leg, a signal Harold remembered from their working days. Someone was here, or had been here recently. The dog's nose never lied, even when his eyes couldn't show him the truth. Harold's heart hammered as he approached the cabin's front door, his flashlight beam dancing across windows too dirty to see through. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding thin in the forest silence. "Anyone in there?" "I got your message." A sound from inside made him freeze. Not quite crying, not quite calling, but something human and desperate that raised every instinct Harold had developed in 40 years of helping people. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The beam of his flashlight revealed a scene that broke his heart and confused him in equal measure. An elderly woman sat huddled in the corner of what had once been the lodge's main room, her white hair wild around her face, her clothes torn and dirty. But it was her eyes that stopped Harold cold. They held the vacant, frightened look he'd seen too many times in nursing homes, the expression of someone whose mind had become an enemy. "Tommy?" the woman whispered, squinting at Harold in the flashlight's glare. "Tommy, is that really you? I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't leave me here." Harold's chest tightened as he knelt beside her, noting the bruises on her wrists, the way she flinched when he moved too quickly. Someone had hurt this woman, scared her badly enough that she'd written a desperate message in what looked like her own blood from scratched fingers. "Ma'am, my name is Harold Thompson. I got your letter. Where's Emma? Is she okay?" The woman, M, presumably, grabbed Harold's jacket with surprising strength. They took her deeper into the woods, said they were going to the old mine shaft where nobody would find her. "Tommy, you have to get her back. She's just a baby." Harold felt the floor drop out from under him, There were abandoned mine shafts scattered throughout these hills, relics from Vermont's mining days that were as dangerous as they were hidden. A child could fall into one of those holes and disappear forever, or worse, someone could use them as a perfect place to hide evidence of crimes too terrible to contemplate. "How long ago?" Harold asked, helping the woman to her feet. "How long since they took Emma?" But Em was staring at something over his shoulder, her expression shifting from relief to terror. "Tommy, there's something wrong with your eyes. You look so old. What happened to your face?" It hit Harold like a physical blow. This woman thought he was someone named Tommy, someone she obviously loved and trusted. Her mind was playing tricks that felt real to her, and he was walking into a situation he didn't understand with information that might not even be accurate. Buddy whined again, more urgently this time, and Harold realized the dog was focused on something in the back of the cabin. Following Buddy's lead, Harold's flashlight found a child's backpack thrown in the corner, small sneakers lined up by the door, and an inhaler that made his blood run cold. "Ma'am, is Emma asthmatic? Does she need this medicine?" Em nodded frantically. "She can't breathe without it. That's why they have to bring her back. She gets scared, and then she can't breathe, and then—" Her words dissolved into sobs that sounded like they came from the deepest place of human despair. Harold felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, the same feeling he'd carried as a teacher when a child was in trouble, the same urgency he'd felt as a deputy when every second counted. But he was 72 years old, with a bad heart and medication that was back home in his bathroom cabinet. He had no backup, no radio, no way to call for help even if he wanted to. "Who took her?" Harold asked gently, trying to keep his voice calm while his mind raced through options. "Can you tell me what they looked like?" Em's eyes cleared for just a moment, and in that brief window of lucidity Harold saw intelligence and pain that took his breath away. "My son," she whispered. "David took her. He said I couldn't take care of her anymore. He said they were going to put me away, so I had to disappear. But Emma followed me, and now she's in trouble because of me." The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. This wasn't a stranger abduction. This was a family crisis that had spiraled into something dangerous. David, whoever he was, had probably been trying to get his mother to accept help she didn't want, and now a child was caught in the middle of a tragedy that good intentions had created. "Where would David take her?" Harold asked. "If he was trying to keep her safe, where would he go?" Em pointed toward the back of the cabin, where Harold could see another trail leading deeper into the forest. "The old mining camp. We used to go there when he was little, before I started forgetting things. He thinks I don't remember, but I do." "Some things I remember perfectly." Harold looked at Buddy, who was already moving toward the back door, his nose working the scent trail that would lead them deeper into the woods and further from any hope of rescue if things went wrong. The smart thing would be to stay here with Em, wait for morning, hope that David came to his senses and brought Emma back on his own. But the inhaler in his hand told a different story. If Emma was having an asthma attack in the middle of the Vermont wilderness, morning might be too late. "Come on, boy," Harold said to Buddy, feeling years fall away as purpose flooded back into his bones. "Time to do what we do best." Harold helped Margaret to her feet, noting how she weighed almost nothing, like a bird made of hollow bones and fading memories. Her grip on his arm was surprisingly strong, though, driven by the desperate strength that comes from protecting someone you love. "I can't leave you here alone," Harold said, scanning the cabin one more time with his flashlight. "You're coming with us. Can you walk?" Margaret nodded, though her eyes had that distant look again, as if she was seeing through time to some other moment, some other crisis. "Tommy always said I was tougher than I looked. Remember when you broke your arm falling out of the apple tree? I carried you all the way home." Harold didn't correct her. In her mind, he was Tommy, someone who mattered enough that she'd risk everything to save a child. If that delusion gave her the strength to keep moving, he'd be Tommy until this was over. Buddy was already at the back door, his nose pressed to the gap beneath the frame where Emma's scent lingered strongest. Even blind, the old dog moved with the purposeful confidence of a professional tracker. His tail was rigid, his body language screaming that he'd found the trail they needed to follow. The forest behind the cabin was different from the logged areas they'd driven through, older, wilder, filled with the kind of shadows that seemed to breathe with their own dark life. Harold's flashlight beam carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, but beyond its reach lay the vast Vermont wilderness that could swallow a person without a trace. They walked single file down what might have been a deer path, Harold in front with the flashlight, Margaret behind him muttering fragments of conversations with people who weren't there, and Buddy bringing up the rear despite being their actual guide. The dog would pause occasionally, testing the air, then surge forward with renewed confidence that Emma had passed this way. "Tommy, do you remember when we used to come out here for picnics?" Margaret's voice drifted through the darkness. "Before your father left. Before everything got so complicated. You loved those old mine shafts, always wanting to explore where you weren't supposed to go." Harold's blood chilled. If David had grown up playing in these mines, he'd know exactly which ones were stable enough to hide in and which ones were death traps waiting to happen. A man desperate enough to take a child into the woods might not be thinking clearly about safety. The trail wound upward through increasingly rocky terrain, and Harold felt his heart hammering against his ribs with each step. His medication was hours overdue, and the combination of stress and exertion was making his chest tight. But Emma's inhaler bounced against his jacket pocket with every step, a constant reminder that someone else's breathing was in even more immediate danger than his own. "How much further?" he asked Margaret, though he wasn't sure she'd remember the answer even if she knew it. "Just over the ridge," she said, her voice suddenly clear and present. "There's a whole complex of mine entrances up there. Some of them connect underground, but most are just dead ends full of old equipment. David used to pretend he was searching for treasure." They crested the hill, and Harold's flashlight revealed a nightmare landscape of industrial decay. Rusted mining equipment squatted among the trees like metal skeletons, and dark holes gaped in the hillside like mouths that had swallowed too many secrets. Any one of those entrances could hide a man and child, and searching them all would take hours they didn't have. But Buddy was already moving toward the largest opening, his nose working overtime. The dog paused at the entrance and whined. Not the excited whine of a successful track, but something more troubled, fear maybe, or uncertainty about what lay in the darkness ahead. Harold played his flashlight into the mine entrance and saw footprints in the muddy floor, adult boots and smaller sneakers that made his heart leap with hope and terror. They were here, or had been here recently. But the darkness beyond his flashlight beam was absolute, the kind of black that seemed to swallow light and sound and hope. "David?" Harold called into the mine. "David, my name is Harold Thompson. I'm here to help. Emma needs her inhaler." His voice echoed back from the depths, distorted and multiplied until it sounded like a chorus of old men calling into the void. But underneath the echoes, Harold heard something that made his blood freeze, a child's cough, wet and labored, coming from somewhere deep in the mine. "She's having an attack," Margaret whispered, grabbing Harold's arm. "I can hear it in her breathing. That's the sound she makes when she's really scared." Harold started into the mine, but Buddy blocked his path, whining and pawing at the ground. The dog's behavior was unmistakable. Danger ahead, proceed with caution. In their working days, that warning had saved Harold's life more than once. "What is it, boy?" Harold knelt beside Buddy, running his hands over the dog's trembling body. "What do you smell in there?" A voice from the darkness answered his question. "Don't come any closer." It was a man's voice, rough with exhaustion and something that might have been despair. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I can't let you take her. She's all I have left." Harold felt Margaret stiffen beside him. "David?" she called into the mine. "David, is that you?" "Mom?" The voice cracked like a teenager's, though David had to be middle-aged by now. "Mom, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be safe. You're supposed to be somewhere they can take care of you." "I don't want to be taken care of," Margaret said, and for a moment her voice carried all the dignity and strength she must have possessed before her mind started betraying her. "I want to take care of the people I love. That's what mothers do." Harold heard movement in the mine, footsteps on loose rock, and then a different sound that made his chest tighten with recognition. Emma was crying. Not the normal tears of a frightened child, but the desperate, breathless sobbing that meant her airways were closing. "She needs her medicine," Harold called into the darkness. "David, I have her inhaler. Let me bring it to her." "How do I know you're not with them?" David's voice was closer now, maybe 30 feet into the mine. "How do I know you're not here to take her away from me?" Harold felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. This wasn't about kidnapping. This was about a man so desperate to keep his family together that he'd lost sight of what family actually meant. David wasn't trying to hurt Emma. He was trying to save her from something he saw as a worse fate. "Because I'm here with your mother," Harold said, stepping closer to the mine entrance but keeping his hands visible in the flashlight beam. "Because she wrote me a letter asking for help, and I came. Just like you would come if someone you loved was in trouble." Margaret pushed past Harold before he could stop her, walking into the mine with the fearless determination of a woman who'd spent her life protecting children. "David Michael Walsh, you get out here this instant. That little girl can't breathe and you're making it worse by scaring her." The silence that followed felt eternal, broken only by Emma's labored breathing echoing from the depths. Then Harold heard footsteps, slow and reluctant, coming toward the light. David Walsh emerged from the mine like a man walking toward his own execution, carrying Emma in his arms as her small body shuddered with each desperate attempt to breathe. Harold's flashlight revealed a face etched with exhaustion and desperation. This wasn't the hardened criminal Harold had been expecting, but a broken man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Emma couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her dark hair plastered to her head with sweat, her lips tinged with the blue that meant her oxygen levels were dangerously low. Her eyes were wide with terror, not just from the asthma attack, but from the confusion of being caught in an adult crisis she couldn't possibly understand. "Please," David whispered, his voice cracking as he looked between Harold and Margaret. "Please don't take her from me. She's the only family I have left. If they put Mom in a home and Emma goes back to her parents, I'll have nobody. I'll be completely alone." Harold felt recognition hit him like a physical blow. Those words, that desperate plea, he'd heard them before, decades ago, from a troubled 10-year-old student who'd been shuffled between foster homes so many times he'd stopped believing anyone would stay. David Walsh. He'd taught David Walsh in 4th grade back when the boy was just another kid trying to survive a system that moved him around like a chess piece. "David," Harold said softly, pulling Emma's inhaler from his pocket. "I need you to let me help Emma first. Then we'll figure out the rest." But Emma's attack was worsening. Her breathing had become a high-pitched wheeze that barely moved air, and her fingernails were turning blue, despite David's attempts to keep her calm. Harold had seen enough medical emergencies to know they were running out of time. Another few minutes without proper oxygen, and Emma could suffer brain damage or worse. Harold moved forward slowly, keeping his voice steady and calm. "David, remember Mrs. Patterson's classroom, room 15? You sat in the 3rd row by the window because you liked watching the birds during math lessons." David's eyes widened with shocked recognition. "Mr. Thompson." Harold Thompson from Riverside Elementary? That's right. And right now I need you to trust me like you did when you were 10 years old and scared of everything. Let me help Emma breathe, and then we'll talk about everything else." David's resistance crumbled. He sank to his knees in the muddy clearing, still holding Emma, but no longer trying to back away. Harold knelt beside them, gently taking the inhaler and showing Emma how to use it, speaking in the same calm voice he'd used with frightened students for 40 years. "That's it, sweetheart. Big puff. Hold it in. You're being so brave." Another puff now, nice and slow. Emma's color began to improve almost immediately, her breathing becoming less frantic as the medication opened her airways. But Harold could see she was exhausted, probably had been fighting the attack for hours while David panicked and made increasingly desperate decisions. Margaret settled beside them like a grandmother bird gathering her chicks, her confusion temporarily cleared by the maternal instinct that survived even when memory failed. She stroked Emma's hair and hummed something that might have been a lullaby, and slowly, miraculously, Emma's breathing returned to something approaching normal. "There we go," Harold said, checking Emma's pulse and finding it strong if still too fast. "You're going to be okay, honey, but we need to get you somewhere warm and safe where you can rest." David's face crumpled as the immediate crisis passed and the larger reality crashed back down on him. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I was just trying to... God, what have I done? I've put her in the hospital. I've traumatized her. I'm no better than all the people who hurt me when I was her age." Harold sat back on his heels, studying the man who'd been his student 3 decades ago. David had grown up to be tall and lean, with the kind of nervous energy that spoke of too much coffee and too little sleep. His clothes were expensive but rumpled, his hands soft like someone who worked in an office, but his eyes held the same wounded look they'd carried when he was 10. "Tell me what happened," Harold said. "All of it. Start from the beginning." David's story spilled out in fragments between Emma's recovering breaths and Margaret's soft humming. He'd been a successful investment banker in Boston until the market crash wiped out his portfolio and his marriage in the same brutal year. Divorced, broke, and facing bankruptcy, he'd come back to Vermont to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. That's when he'd discovered Margaret living alone in a house that was falling apart around her, her Alzheimer's advancing to the point where she'd started wandering and forgetting to eat. Emma was the neighbor's daughter, but her parents worked double shifts, and Margaret had become an unofficial babysitter, one of the few connections to reality that still made sense to her failing mind. "The social worker said she needed full-time care," David explained, his voice thick with guilt and exhaustion. "They were going to put her in a memory care facility, sell the house to pay for it. But she was terrified. She kept talking about how they put people away to die, how once you go into one of those places, your family forgets you exist." Harold nodded, understanding the fear that drove people to desperate measures. He'd seen it with Ruth during her final illness, the terror of losing control, of becoming a burden, of disappearing into institutional care where you became a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. "So you tried to take care of her yourself?" "I tried. God, I tried so hard, but I don't know anything about caregiving. I can analyze market trends and manage investment portfolios, but I can't make her remember to take her medication or stop her from wandering off at 3 in the morning. And Emma, she'd come over after school and Mom would light up. It was the only time she seemed happy." The pieces were falling into place now, painting a picture of good intentions colliding with impossible circumstances. David had been trying to keep his makeshift family together, but his inexperience and desperation had created a crisis that put everyone in danger. "When the social workers came this morning for the final evaluation," David continued, "Mom panicked. She grabbed Emma and ran into the woods. I've been chasing them for hours, and when I finally caught up, Emma was already having trouble breathing. I thought if I could just find a safe place to hide until I figured out what to do." "You thought wrong," Harold said, but his voice carried understanding rather than judgment. "But your heart was in the right place. That counts for something." Emma stirred in David's arms, her breathing now steady enough that she could speak. "Are we going home now?" she asked in a small voice. "I want to go home to Grandma Maggie." Margaret's eyes cleared at the sound of Emma's voice, and she reached over to touch the little girl's cheek. "Of course we're going home, sweetheart. Harold's going to help us find our way back. Aren't you, Harold?" It was the first time all evening that Margaret had called him by his real name instead of Tommy, and Harold felt something shift in the dynamics of their unlikely group. Maybe she was having a moment of clarity, or maybe her mind had simply found a new story that made sense of their situation. Either way, she was looking at him with trust and hope, waiting for him to fix what seemed unfixable. Harold looked around at the faces surrounding him. An old woman losing her grip on reality but still fierce in her love, a grown man broken by the weight of trying to save everyone, a little girl who just wanted to feel safe, and an old dog who'd traveled impossible distances to bring them all together. They were depending on him to find a solution that satisfied everyone's needs without destroying anyone's heart. The problem was, Harold had no idea what that solution might look like. The walk back toward civilization should have felt like victory, but Harold could sense the tragedy building with each step they took through the darkening forest. Emma rode on David's shoulders now, her breathing steady but her small body exhausted from the ordeal. Margaret walked between Harold and David, occasionally reaching out to touch both men as if reassuring herself they were real and not just figments of her failing memory. Buddy moved ahead of them with increasing difficulty, his blind eyes clouded with pain that went deeper than arthritis. Harold had seen enough working dogs reach the end of their careers to recognize the signs, the labored breathing, the slight tremor in the hindquarters, the way Buddy kept pausing to rest against trees as if the forest itself was holding him up. "How old is he?" David asked quietly, nodding toward the golden retriever who was struggling to maintain his usual professional pace. "He'd be 22 now if my math is right," Harold replied, his voice tight with an emotion he didn't want to name. "Most dogs his size don't live past 14. He should have been gone years ago." But Harold knew why Buddy was still alive, still pushing forward through pain that would have stopped a younger dog. The same stubborn loyalty that had made him such a good partner was keeping him alive just long enough to complete one last mission. Dogs didn't understand retirement or rest. They understood purpose, and Buddy's purpose had always been finding people who needed to be found. Margaret stumbled over a root and would have fallen if Harold hadn't caught her arm. She was fading fast, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the crisis now giving way to the profound exhaustion that came with advanced Alzheimer's. Her lucid moments were becoming briefer, separated by longer stretches where she seemed to forget where they were or why they were walking through dark woods. "Now, Tommy," she whispered, looking up at Harold with eyes that held decades of accumulated confusion. "I can't remember why we're out here. Did something happen to Emma?" Emma heard her name and twisted around on David's shoulders to look down at Margaret with the gentle patience that children sometimes showed when adults became the ones who needed protection. "It's okay, Grandma Maggie. We're going home. Mr. Harold is taking us home." But Harold wasn't sure where home was anymore, or if such a place even existed for their fractured group. The social workers would be waiting, along with police reports and custody hearings and all the legal machinery that ground up families like theirs and sorted the pieces into neat institutional categories. They reached Harold's broken-down truck just as full darkness settled over the forest. The old Ford sat where he'd left it, steam no longer rising from under the hood, but clearly dead as a doornail. Harold tried the ignition one more time out of stubborn hope, but got nothing except a click that sounded like mechanical laughter. "Guess we're walking the rest of the way," Harold said. But even as he spoke, he could see that Margaret wasn't going to make it much further. She was leaning heavily against the truck's fender, her breathing shallow and rapid, her eyes holding the vacant look that meant her mind had retreated to some safer place where nothing made sense, but nothing hurt either. David set Emma down carefully and moved to his mother's side, his face etched with the helpless frustration of someone watching a loved one disappear by degrees. "Mom, can you hear me? We need to keep walking." Margaret looked at him without recognition, then at Harold, then at Emma, as if she was seeing strangers who'd wandered into her private world. Her mouth moved soundlessly for a moment before she managed to speak. "I want to go home," she said, but her voice held the lost quality of someone who'd forgotten what home looked like. "Please, I just want to go home." That's when they heard the sirens. The sound came from the direction of the main road, multiple vehicles moving fast through the night with the urgency that meant serious trouble. Harold felt his stomach drop as he realized what was happening. Someone had reported Emma missing, which meant police, social services, maybe even FBI if they'd classified this as a kidnapping. "They're coming for us," David said, his voice flat with defeated acceptance. "Someone must have seen us, or found Mom's letter, or—" He trailed off, looking at Emma with an expression that broke Harold's heart. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm sorry I couldn't keep us together." Emma reached for David's hand with the instinctive trust of a child who didn't fully understand adult failures. "Are they going to take me away from you and Grandma Maggie?" David couldn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. Harold watched the man's face crumble as the reality hit home. Good intentions didn't matter when you'd technically kidnapped a child, even if that child was safer with you than anywhere else. The law didn't recognize love as a defense, and the system didn't care about keeping families together when those families didn't fit the proper legal definitions. The sirens were getting closer, maybe 10 minutes away now. Soon, the forest would be full of flashlights and radios and officials who'd sort everyone into their proper categories: victim, perpetrator, witness, ward of the state. They'd take Emma back to parents who worked too much to notice when she was struggling. They'd put Margaret in a facility where she'd be safe and medicated and slowly forgotten. They'd arrest David for kidnapping and ruin what was left of his life. And Harold would go home alone to his empty house and his cold coffee and his photographs of people who'd loved him once upon a time. That's when Buddy collapsed. The old dog simply folded up like his legs had been cut from under him, falling heavily to the forest floor with a whimper that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than pain. Harold dropped to his knees beside his partner, running his hands over Buddy's body and finding the rapid, irregular heartbeat that meant the end was finally coming. "No," Harold whispered, gathering Buddy's head into his lap. "Not now, boy. Not when we're so close. You can't leave me now." But Buddy's cloudy eyes found Harold's face in the darkness, and Harold saw something there that looked almost like relief. The dog had found the people who needed finding. He'd brought his partner out of retirement for one last case, one final chance to make a difference. His work was done. Margaret knelt beside them with surprising grace, her confusion temporarily lifted by the presence of suffering that even her damaged mind could recognize. She placed her hand on Buddy's side and began to hum the same lullaby she'd sung to Emma, a sound that seemed to ease the dog's labored breathing. "He's been waiting," she said, her voice clear and present in a way it hadn't been all evening. "Dogs do that, you know. They wait until their people are ready to let them go." The sirens were close enough now that Harold could see the glow of emergency lights through the trees. In a few minutes, this clearing would be flooded with officials and questions and consequences that none of them were prepared to face. But for this moment, in the darkness beside his dying partner, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the weight of being needed by people who mattered. Emma crawled over to them and placed her small hand on Buddy's head, stroking his ears with the gentle instinct that children had for comforting creatures in pain. David stood behind them, his hand on his mother's shoulder, all of them connected by the simple act of witnessing a good dog's final moments. "Thank you," Harold whispered to Buddy, feeling 30 years of grief finally finding its proper place in his heart. "Thank you for coming back. Thank you for showing me I wasn't done yet." Buddy's tail moved once, a barely perceptible wag that somehow conveyed everything that needed to be said between partners. Then his breathing slowed, evened out, and finally stopped altogether. The sirens reached the main road just as Harold felt Buddy's heart give its last beat. The emergency lights painted the trees in reds and blues that looked like Christmas decorations in a world that had forgotten how to celebrate. Soon there would be questions and accusations and the grinding machinery of justice applied to a situation that had no villains, only people trying to love each other in impossible circumstances. But Harold wasn't ready to face that world yet. He sat in the darkness holding his partner's head, surrounded by a broken family that had somehow found its way to wholeness in the last place anyone would think to look for it. The tragedy wasn't that Buddy was gone. It was that the world was about to tear apart the only good thing that had come from his sacrifice. The first police officer to reach them was a young woman with kind eyes and the careful movements of someone trained to de-escalate crisis situations. She approached slowly, her flashlight lowered so it wouldn't blind them, taking in the scene with the quick assessment that separated good cops from dangerous ones. Harold looked up from Buddy's still form, prepared to explain everything. The letter, the chase through the woods, the complicated family dynamics that had led to this moment. But before he could speak, the officer knelt beside them with an expression that stopped his words in his throat. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly. "Harold Thompson. You probably don't remember me, but I'm Sarah Mitchell. You taught my little brother Danny about 15 years ago at Riverside Elementary." The name clicked into place, and Harold felt another piece of the puzzle shift in his understanding. Danny Mitchell had been one of those students who stayed with you, a scared kid from a broken home who'd needed extra patience and encouragement to believe he could learn anything at all. "Danny Mitchell," Harold repeated, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Red hair, freckles, used to hide in the coat closet when the math got too hard. How is he?" "He's a paramedic now," Sarah said, her voice warm with pride and something that might have been gratitude. "Says you're the reason he learned to read properly. Changed his whole life." She looked around at the group clustered around Buddy's body. "What happened here, Mr. Thompson? We got a call about a missing child, possible kidnapping." That's when the full weight of their situation hit Harold like a physical blow. In all the chaos and emotion of the last few hours, he'd forgotten that they must look like exactly what they were. An elderly man, a confused woman with dementia, and a desperate father who'd taken a child into the wilderness. From the outside, this looked like a textbook case of kidnapping and elder abuse. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't looking at them like criminals. She was looking at them like people who needed help, and Harold realized that sometimes the difference between tragedy and miracle came down to who showed up when everything fell apart. "It's complicated," Harold said, glancing at David, who was holding his mother close while Emma dozed against his shoulder. "But before we get into all that, you should know, this isn't what it looks like." Sarah nodded, speaking quietly into her radio to call off the intensive search that was probably mobilizing even as they spoke. "Why don't you tell me what it is, then, from the beginning?" So Harold did. He told her about Buddy appearing with the bloody letter, about Margaret's Alzheimer's and her terror of being institutionalized, about David's desperate attempt to keep a makeshift family together. He explained about Emma's asthma attack and how they'd all ended up in the woods trying to save each other from different kinds of abandonment. As he talked, more officials arrived: paramedics, social workers, a supervisor from the sheriff's department who'd worked with Harold back in his deputy days. But instead of the hostile interrogation Harold had been expecting, something else was happening. Sarah Mitchell was telling the other officers about Harold's reputation, about his years of service to the community, about the dozens of students whose lives he'd changed. "Harold Thompson doesn't kidnap children," Harold heard her say to the supervisor. "Harold Thompson finds lost children and brings them home safely." There's got to be more to this story. David, meanwhile, had been expecting to be arrested on the spot. Instead, he found himself talking to a social worker named Janet who listened without judgment as he explained his mother's condition and his attempts to care for her. She was asking practical questions about Margaret's medical needs and Emma's family situation, but she wasn't immediately talking about arrests or custody. "The problem," Janet said after hearing the whole story, "is that good intentions don't change the legal reality. Emma's parents are frantic. They've been looking for her for 8 hours, thinking she'd been abducted. And Mrs. Walsh needs professional care that you're not qualified to provide, no matter how much you love her." Harold felt the moment slipping away from them, all the connection and purpose he'd rediscovered dissolving back into the bureaucratic machinery that sorted people into categories and processed problems rather than solving them. Emma would go back to parents who loved her but barely knew her. Margaret would go to a memory care facility where she'd be safe but forgotten. David would face charges that would destroy what was left of his life. And Harold would go home to his empty house, having learned that even when the universe gave you a second chance, the world wasn't necessarily ready to let you take it. That's when Sarah Mitchell said something that changed everything. "You know, Mr. Thompson, I've been thinking about what you said, about how Mrs. Walsh wrote that letter asking for help, and somehow her dog found you specifically. That's either the most incredible coincidence in the world, or something else is going on here." Harold looked up at her, not sure where she was heading, but sensing that it mattered. "What if," Sarah continued, "this wasn't really about kidnapping at all? What if this was about a family in crisis reaching out for help, and the help finally arriving? What if Mrs. Walsh wasn't confused when she wrote that letter? What if she was clearer than she'd been in months about what they all needed?" Janet, the social worker, frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe we're looking at this all wrong. Maybe instead of processing these people into the system, we should be asking how the system can support what they've already built together." Harold felt something shift in the air around them, a sense that the conversation was moving toward possibility rather than consequences. He looked at Margaret, who was lucid enough to be listening to every word, and saw her nod slightly. "What does that look like practically?" Janet asked, but her tone suggested she was genuinely curious rather than dismissive. Sarah looked at Harold with an expression that reminded him of her little brother when he'd finally grasped a math concept that had been eluding him for weeks. What if Mr. Thompson wasn't a random good Samaritan? What if he was exactly the right person to help this family figure out how to stay together safely? The pieces clicked into place so clearly that Harold wondered why none of them had seen it before. He had the experience, the training, and most importantly, the time to help David learn how to care for Margaret properly. His empty house had room for people who needed a place to belong. Emma's parents worked long hours, but lived close enough that she could still be part of both families. "You're talking about some kind of informal guardianship arrangement," Janet said slowly. "It would need oversight, regular check-ins, proper medical care for Mrs. Walsh, all of which Mr. Thompson is qualified to coordinate," Sarah said. "He's been helping families navigate crises for 40 years. Why should he stop now just because he's retired?" David looked up from where he'd been sitting with Margaret, his face showing the first hope Harold had seen there all evening. "You'd do that?" You'd help us stay together?" Harold looked around at the faces surrounding him, Margaret confused but trusting, Emma sleeping peacefully despite everything she'd been through, David desperate for a way to love his family without destroying them, Sarah Mitchell giving him a chance to matter again. "I'd be honored to," Harold said, and meant it. But even as the officials began discussing the practical details of how such an arrangement might work, Harold felt a deeper truth settling into his bones. This wasn't really about him rescuing a broken family. This was about a broken family rescuing him from the slow death of purposelessness, giving him back the reason to get up in the morning that he'd lost when Ruth died and his teaching career ended. Buddy had brought them all together for one last case, and the case wasn't about finding Emma or saving Margaret or helping David. The case was about proving that family wasn't something you were born into or legally assigned to. It was something you chose, something you built, something you fought for even when the whole world told you it was impossible. As the paramedics gently lifted Buddy's body onto a stretcher and the officials began the paperwork that would transform a crisis into a solution, Harold felt 30 years of grief and 3 years of loneliness finally beginning to heal. He had work to do, people to care for, a purpose that mattered. He wasn't done yet, after all. 6 months later, Harold Thompson stood at his kitchen window watching Emma teach a golden retriever puppy how to sit properly in the backyard of what had become the most unlikely household in Riverside, Vermont. The puppy, Buddy Jr., as Emma had named him despite Harold's protests that it was too soon, was all enthusiasm and no coordination, tumbling over his own paws in his eagerness to please. "Patience, sweetheart," Harold called through the open window. "Good dogs are made, not born. Takes time to learn what matters." Emma looked up and waved, her dark hair caught in the morning sunlight, her face glowing with the confidence that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The inhaler in her pocket remained unused most days now. Turns out asthma attacks were less frequent when you weren't constantly worried about the adults in your life disappearing. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. Those first few weeks had tested everyone's patience and commitment as they figured out how to blend their lives into something that worked for all of them. Margaret had good days and bad days, moments of startling clarity followed by hours of confusion that left everyone emotionally drained. David struggled with the guilt of needing help and the fear that he was imposing on Harold's generosity. Emma missed her parents during the week, but gradually accepted that she could have two families who loved her in different ways. Harold had been the anchor that kept them all steady, drawing on 40 years of teaching experience to help a grown man learn patience with his failing mother, and decades of law enforcement training to establish routines that kept everyone safe without making anyone feel imprisoned. "Harold, could you help me with this medication schedule?" David called from the dining room table, where he was organizing Margaret's pills for the week. It had taken months, but David was finally learning to manage his mother's complex medical needs with the thoroughness of a man who'd once managed million-dollar investment portfolios. The dining room had become command central for their unconventional family, walls covered with calendars, medication charts, emergency contact numbers, and photos from their new life together. There were pictures of Emma's 8th birthday party, Margaret's good day at the county fair, David's first successful attempt at making Sunday dinner without burning anything, and Harold teaching Buddy Jr. to track scents in the backyard. "Coming," Harold said, but he paused for one more moment at the window, marveling at how full his house felt now. The silence that had haunted these rooms for 3 years was gone, replaced by the comfortable chaos of people who'd chosen to build something together. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair by the fireplace, working on a jigsaw puzzle that she'd restart every few days without frustration. Her short-term memory might be failing, but her capacity for joy remained intact, especially when Emma crawled into her lap to help with the difficult pieces. "Grandma Maggie," Emma was saying now as she came inside with the puppy, "Buddy Jr. learned to sit today. Want to see?" Margaret's face lit up with the uncomplicated delight that made all the hard days worthwhile. "Of course, sweetheart. Show me what our smart boy can do." Harold settled at the dining room table with David, reviewing the carefully organized medication schedule that had become as complex as any business plan David had ever created. The doctors had been skeptical at first about an Alzheimer's patient living in a home environment, but Margaret's condition had actually stabilized under the care of people who loved her rather than simply managed her. "Doctor, Peterson wants to adjust her evening medication," David said, pointing to notes he'd taken during Margaret's latest appointment. "She's been more agitated at bedtime, probably sundowning symptoms." Harold nodded, impressed as always by how thoroughly David had educated himself about his mother's condition. The scared, desperate man who'd taken Emma into the woods had transformed into a devoted caregiver who approached every challenge with methodical determination. "We could try moving dinner earlier," Harold suggested. "Sometimes the routine helps more than the medication. And maybe we should ask Emma to spend more time reading to her before bed. You know how much that calms her down." As if summoned by their conversation, Emma appeared beside them with Buddy Jr. in her arms. The puppy was getting too big to carry, but Emma hadn't quite accepted that her baby was growing up. "Daddy David, can I take Buddy Jr. to show Mom and Dad when they pick me up for weekend?" Emma asked, using the title that had evolved naturally over the months. Her biological parents were Mom and Dad, but David had become Daddy David, and Harold was Grandpa Harold, and Margaret was Grandma Maggie. The complexity that might have confused other families worked perfectly for theirs. David smiled, the expression coming more easily now than it had 6 months ago. "If it's okay with Grandpa Harold and your parents don't mind dog hair in their car." Harold watched this exchange with the deep satisfaction of a man who'd helped architect something beautiful from the pieces of several broken lives. Emma's biological parents, Lisa and Tom, had been skeptical at first about the arrangement, but they'd gradually come to appreciate how happy and secure their daughter was. They worked long hours at the hospital. Both were nurses, and knowing Emma was cared for by people who genuinely loved her had lifted a weight from their shoulders they hadn't even realized they were carrying. The front door opened and Lisa's voice called out, "We're here for our girl!" Emma shrieked with delight and ran toward the front hall, Buddy Jr. bounding beside her. Harold smiled at the sound. 6 months ago, Emma had been a quiet, anxious child who seemed to carry the weight of adult worries on her small shoulders. Now she was loud and confident and gloriously childlike, secure in the knowledge that she had multiple families who wanted nothing more than her happiness. "In here?" Harold called, rising to greet Lisa and Tom. The relationship between Emma's biological parents and her extended chosen family had required careful navigation, but Harold's experience with delicate parent-teacher conferences had served him well in helping everyone focus on what was best for Emma. Elisa appeared in the doorway with Tom behind her, both of them wearing the comfortable smiles of people who no longer worried about whether their child was safe and loved. They'd initially been suspicious of the arrangement, unable to believe that strangers would take such an interest in their daughter without some hidden agenda. But months of watching Harold, David, and Margaret pour genuine affection into Emma had convinced them that sometimes the universe provided exactly what a family needed, even when it came in unexpected packages. "How was her week?" Lisa asked, though she could see the answer in Emma's glowing face and confident posture. "She taught Buddy Jr. to sit, helped David organize Margaret's photo albums, and read 3 chapter books to Grandma Maggie," Harold reported. "Oh, and she got an A on her math test." Tom shook his head in wonder. "She used to hate math." "Said it was too hard, and she wasn't smart enough." "She's plenty smart," Harold said, drawing on decades of experience with children who'd been told they couldn't learn. She just needed people around her who believed in her abilities more than they worried about her limitations. As Emma gathered her backpack and hugged everyone goodbye, Harold felt the familiar pang of letting go mixed with the satisfaction of knowing she'd be back Sunday evening. This was what successful blended families looked like. Not the perfect nuclear unit that greeting cards promoted, but a messy, complicated, deeply loving network of people who'd chosen to prioritize connection over convention. After Emma left with her parents, the house settled into its weekend rhythm. David would spend the afternoon working in Harold's vegetable garden, having discovered a passion for growing things that surprised everyone, including himself. Margaret would nap in her chair while Harold read the newspaper and planned lessons for the adult literacy classes he'd started teaching at the community center. "Harold," David said as he prepared to head outside, "I never asked you. Why did you say yes? That night in the woods when Sarah suggested this arrangement, you could have walked away, gone back to your quiet retirement. Why did you take us on?" Harold considered the question, looking around at the home that had been empty and purposeless 6 months ago, and was now filled with the controlled chaos of people who mattered to each other. Through the window he could see the small headstone they'd placed for Buddy under the apple tree, surrounded by flowers that Emma planted and tended with religious devotion. "Because," Harold said finally, "Buddy spent 30 years trying to teach me that the best things in life come to those who don't give up on love, even when it seems impossible." "Took me until I was 72 to really listen to that lesson." Margaret looked up from her puzzle with one of her moments of perfect clarity. "And sometimes," she added with a smile that held all the wisdom of a woman who'd spent her life caring for others, "love doesn't look like what you expected. Sometimes it looks like a blind dog carrying a letter to exactly the right person at exactly the right time." Harold nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle into his bones. At 72, he'd learned that family wasn't about blood or legal documents or meeting society's expectations. Family was about showing up for each other day after day in whatever way love demanded. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, love demanded everything you had to give and gave you back more than you'd ever dreamed possible. Outside, Buddy Jr. barked once at a passing squirrel, then settled in the shade of the apple tree where his namesake rested. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning. Dear friends, if Harold Thompson's story touched your heart, you're not alone. At 72, Harold thought his days of making a difference were behind him. Sound familiar? Like many of us in our golden years, he'd been told by a society obsessed with youth that retirement meant becoming invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. But when a blind dog brought him a desperate letter written in blood, Harold discovered something powerful. Our most meaningful chapters often begin when the world thinks our story is ending. This tale isn't just about rescuing a missing child. It's about how love finds us when we least expect it, how family can be chosen rather than inherited, and how our accumulated wisdom becomes most valuable when we use it to heal broken hearts. Harold's empty house transformed into a haven of laughter, purpose, and belonging because he chose connection over comfort, service over safety. At 55, 60, or 68, you're not winding down. You're entering the season when your experience, patience, and deep capacity for love can create miracles. Your best days aren't behind you. They're waiting for you to write them. The question isn't whether you're too old to start over. It's whether you're brave enough to believe that the most beautiful families are often the ones we rescue and the ones that rescue us back. Questions for you. What empty rooms in your life could become spaces for unexpected love and purpose? Have you ever felt called to help someone but hesitated because you thought you were too old to make a real difference? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.